Welcome in, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this week's recap of the Lansing Watchdog, your trusted source for small business news. As always, I'm Francesca Rocco Ellis.
And I'm Jacob Manning.
And Jacob, as we saw budget season come to a close with the approval of the state budget, elections are now in the forefront of our news cycles. What can you tell us about the Democratic Senate debate that happened last week?
Yes, that's right, Francesca. There were actually three debates that took place last week. There were two in the Republican gubernatorial primary, but the one we're going to be talking about today is the Senate Democrat primary that's gained a lot of national attention lately. Last week, we saw a heated U.S. Senate primary debate between Congresswoman Haley Stevens and former public health official Abdul El Sayed. This race, of course, reflects a growing divide between the Democratic Party's progressive and centrist wings, and moderators and reporters repeatedly tried to get both candidates to address that issue, but neither fully embraced the framing. Instead, El Sayed focused on outside influence in the money in politics. He argued that Washington insiders and special interest groups like AIPAC are trying to shape the race and emphasized that he has not accepted any corporate money. Throughout the debate, he framed himself as the aggressive alternative and called for reducing corporate influence in government. Stevens took a different approach, repeatedly steering the conversation back to Michigan and her record in Congress. She argued that voters should focus on experience, results, and who is best prepared to serve the state in the Senate. The sharpest exchanges centered on transparency and campaign funding. Stevens criticized El Sayed for not releasing tax returns and financial disclosures, while El Sayed continued to attack what he sees as influence of outside spending and corporate interests supporting Stevens. Stevens also argued that Republicans view El Sayed as an easier opponent in a general election against Republican Mike Rogers. El Sayed pushed back and said that Republicans will attack any Democrat nominee, regardless of ideology. The debate wasn't just about the primary. Both candidates spent time taking aim at Rogers and looking ahead at November. El Sayed promised an aggressive approach in a potential general election matchup, while Stevens focused heavily on the stakes of defeating President Donald Trump and the Republican agenda. Throughout the night, Stevens emphasized her legislative record, economic issues, and electability. El Sayed highlighted a more populist, grassroots-driven approach centered on political change. And while neither candidate wanted to label the race as a battle between progressives and moderates, the contrast between the campaigns was impossible to miss. Now, Francesca, I'm going to kick it back to you to talk about a pretty big news story that broke late last week. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, Jacob. So unpacking the end of one of Michigan's longest running legislative disputes, and the dramatic conclusion left supporters and opponents equally frustrated. On Friday, Governor Gretchen Whitmer vetoed the 9 bills that sat in legislative limbo for nearly 18 months after a constitutional fight between the Michigan House and Senate over whether the measures had to be delivered to her desk. The vetoes came just hours after the Michigan Supreme Court declined to hear appeals from either chamber, effectively leaving it in place a lower court ruling that House Speaker Matt Hall had constitutional duty to present the bills to the governor. But while many Democrats celebrated the court's decision as a victory for the Constitution, that celebration was short-lived. Whitmer immediately vetoed all 9 bills, arguing that signing them now would create major legal and administrative problems. According to the governor, the bills were supposed to take effect in April of 2025. Because they were delayed for more than a year, implementing them now would potentially overwrite laws already in place, create budget complications, miss important deadlines, and trigger years of litigation. Whitmer placed the blame squarely on House Republicans, accusing them of sitting on the legislation for 18 months while taxpayers footed the bill for an extended court battle. She argued that several of the measures could have lowered costs for residents and improved public safety if they had been presented on time. Speaker Hall responded by saying Democrats went through a lengthy legal fight only to have the legislation vetoed in the end. He also pointed out that the bills were finally delivered after recent budget negotiations between Republicans and Democrats. Now, a bit of background on this. The legal dispute began when Hall, after becoming Speaker in 2025, halted the processing of 9 bills passed during the final weeks of Democratic control of the legislature. Senate Democrats sued, arguing the House had a constitutional obligation to deliver the bills to the governor. The case worked its way through the courts, with the Court of Appeals ultimately ruling that the House must present the bills approved by the legislature, and the Supreme Court allowed that ruling to stand. At the center of the fight were several high-profile bills. One of the most significant would have allowed corrections officers to join the state's retirement system, a proposal supporters said would help recruit and retain workers. Other measures dealt with public employee health care costs, bankruptcy protections for struggling families, and funding tools for cultural institutions such as the Detroit Historical Museum. Sources close to the governor indicated Whitmer was particularly supportive of the corrections officer retirement proposal and hopes lawmakers will send a revised version in the future. Senate Majority Leader Whitney Brinks called the court's ruling a victory for the Constitution, but said she was deeply disappointed by the vetoes. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Jocelyn Benson said she would have signed the bills, criticizing what she called a political gamesmanship and arguing that workers who supported the legislation deserved better. After an 18-month legal battle, the bills finally reached the governor's desk, only to be vetoed. Now, the question is whether lawmakers will bring some of those proposals back in the future legislative session. Now, throwing it back to you, Jacob, what can you tell us about brewing tax policy debate?
Yes, for our final story today, we're going to be turning to a tax policy debate that's been a recurring theme in Michigan's 2026 gubernatorial race. House Speaker Matt Hall says that reducing property taxes remains his top priority, but he's also weighing in on an increasingly popular Republican proposal, eliminating Michigan's state income tax. This discussion comes as the remaining Republican candidates for governor have all expressed support for eventually ending the tax, which currently generates roughly $13 billion annually and serves as one of the state's primary sources of revenue. Hall says he agrees with the goal, but not necessarily the timeline. According to the speaker, eliminating the income tax in a single year just isn't realistic. Instead, he envisions a gradual phase out over several years, allowing state government time to adjust while taxpayers see steady reductions in the rate. Hall has pointed to arguments that lower income tax rates make the state more competitive and potentially spurs economic growth. He suggested that getting Michigan's rate below 4% and eventually closer to 3% could have meaningful economic benefits. Still, the biggest question remains is how Michigan would replace the lost revenue. Among the Republican gubernatorial candidates, Congressman John James appears to be the closest to Hall's approach. James has proposed cutting the income tax by 25% in his first year, with the long-term goal of eliminating it entirely. Candidates Mike Cox and Barry Johnson have also endorsed eliminating the income tax, although they've offered fewer details on how quickly they would pursue the change. Of course, the proposal's future depends largely on the outcome of next year's election. Even if Republicans win the governor's office, eliminating the income tax would be difficult without support from the legislature, and the Democratic governor would almost certainly oppose such a move altogether. So for now, the idea remains a long-term goal rather than an immediate reality. It's already shaping up to be a major dividing line in the 2026 campaign and a conversation that Michigan voters are likely to hear much more about in the months ahead. Can you close us out for the week, Francesca?
Absolutely. Before we go, we'd like to remind members that we have some upcoming owner-to-owner events. These are our regional gatherings and are designated for small business owners to connect with their peers, and we would love to see you there. On July 23rd, we'll be in the Great Lakes Bay region and we'll be rounding out the month in the Wayne region. We have plenty of dates planned for the rest of the summer that go into the fall. And for more information, you can scan the QR code below or visit sbam.org/slash events. And I believe that's it for the week. Thanks for tuning in to the Lansing Watchdog, and we'll catch you next week with more updates.